Welcome to this podcast on digital responsibility. There's a vibrant community across the world at the moment driving forward corporate digital responsibility, which includes a range of aspects from digital ethics, digital for the environment, sustainability, digital well-being, inclusion, accessibility, and more. My name is Rob Price, one of the founders of Corporate Digital Responsibility back in 2017. If you'd like to know more, have a look at the website corporatedigitalresponsibility.net. Welcome to episode 9, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Tony Fish. Tony, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, Rob. Thank you very much for inviting me on. I think that the simplest way to say what I do is I've sat on a large number of boards because I've been an investor for the last 20 odd years, and I'm resigned from an awful lot of boards as I found I wasn't able to get access to the information and data that I needed to make decisions. And that's made me reflect on how we do corporate governance, particularly in a digital world and a data-led world, in a completely different way. So we can actually allow directors to be responsible and accountable, but actually be informed at the same time.
And of course, for everyone listening, they'll kind of immediately recognise the theme of the conversation that we've had running for a few weeks now, which is kind of that very point about use of data, access to data, privacy around data, appropriate use of data, ethical use of data. And I'm very conscious in terms of some of the things that you've been doing. It's been quite a while that you've been looking at these things. I mean, my digital footprint goes back 10 years.
Yeah, 12 years. I wrote it 12 years ago and published it 11. And the principle of that one was when your privacy becomes somebody else's business model, which, 12 years ago was quite revolutionary. And now it's fairly much run of the mill, I suppose.
Do you think there's been the progress in terms, I mean, again, going back to that time, I remember conversations around personal ownership of data, personal monetization of data. I haven't necessarily seen that progress. So do you think there's more to go yet? Where are we heading?
Yeah, I think and one of the fundamentals I didn't think through when I wrote the book, and partly, hindsight's a wonderful thing. I didn't have a data philosophy. I didn't understand the purpose of data. I didn't understand why I was trying really, or what the North Star of the data I was trying to get access to do the analysis, to create the wisdom, to create the business model was about. And looking back now, yeah, there was sort of an ideology that if you got lots of data, you could definitely model somebody. And probably 4 years after I wrote the book, I came to the epiphany that was completely delusional. There is no way we were ever going to be able to understand the microbiome, how that was affecting the gut brain axis. Therefore, the likelihood of behavior could change on what you eat. And suddenly that whole ideology of this behavior gets this piece of data tells us this, and therefore we can do behavioral analysis, is broken. But because we haven't gone back to say what is our North Star, what is our purpose of data, we carry on assuming huge swathes of what data is capable of doing.
And I think many organizations are still drowning in the what data have we got? How do we use the data? How do we structure the data? I mean, kind of the levels of maturity that are out there in the market are very wide and variable. I'm conscious one of the things that you also do is lecture and talk to people from an academic perspective. I'm interested. I mean, it's very consistent with kind of things that I see across corporate digital responsibility as a whole, and often get into conversations around this bridge that needs to be made from academic insight and thought and new approaches, new considerations in terms of, in this case, use of data into the business environment, into the economy. I'm guessing that also gives you a kind of a strong perspective from both sides, doesn't it?
Yeah, so I've got three academic roles in effect. The first one, I'm the entrepreneurs in residence at Bradford Management College, where I did my MBA a ridiculous number of years ago, 30 years ago. I a visiting fellow at Henley Business School in innovation and entrepreneurship, and I teach on the masters and post and PhD courses at LSE in AI and ethics, and I find them really helpful because quite often in the academic world you can play with the complexity, and what that allows you to do is work out the simple linear narrative, which allows you to then explain effectively to the commercial world, what's gonna go on. And there has to be that linkage. But quite often, particularly on this data issue, the commercial world effectively has led. And because it's led, it's sort of had its simple linear narrative, but it wasn't really embedded in good academic or experimental rigor. There was no scientific method behind why we were doing things. It was, ooh, that looks interesting, let's go do it, as opposed to having rigor behind why we're doing it, coming out with the hypothesis, testing it. If it changed, then you went back and having that reflective piece, which has huge value because it allows you to get to a narrative which is actually embedded in science as opposed to wishful thinking and hope.
I mean, it's an interesting kind of introduction to the whole kind of point around ethics and ethics in terms of data and AI, especially in terms of boards. One of the things that I wrote about recently was whose responsibility is it across the board to be cognizant of the use of data and technologies such as AI across the business and the impact that that can have. Lots of kind of views from an academic perspective across the world in that space at the moment. I suspect relatively immature in terms of impacting businesses day in, day out in terms of advisory boards, ethics panels, etc. But I see that that's something else that you've been involved in. So what have you found from that? Isn't it a bank that you're involved in, an ethics board?
Yeah, I think it's the time it was the world's first board bank to create a separate reporting committee for data ethics and privacy, and that's been fascinatingly interesting. It's a non-commercial board, so it doesn't receive any commercial information from the bank at all. It is only there to resolve effectively issues which arise because we have to deal with data and ethics. And they're wide and vast, and we're kind of like learning as we go, but we're trying to do it. And it stemmed from a question which I keep reflecting on and keep asking, which is who's responsible for better decisions?
Yeah.
And much like your question to the board, who's responsible for data? And everybody is responsible, but nobody's accountable, or whichever way around you want to do it. And the same for better decisions, that kind of like we all implicitly believe we should be better at decisions, but nobody has a KPI for a better decision because there's no proof that the outcome is, a better place. It's just that you get reward. And we haven't, data allows us to decouple this, but we haven't explored it. And that's, I suppose, where the ethics come in.
And I appreciate that this is going to be an impossible question to answer in the context of what you've actually done or what you've actually seen in that role. But I think one of the things that I'm really interested in is, can data ethics boards in business or advisory panels in business make a difference? Can they change those decisions? Can the business recognize that actually the advice and the information they are provided, the guidance they are provided, whether it come from legal or compliance or ethical or principle standpoint, that actually kind of they go a different direction on the back of that? Have you seen, or have you at least seen kind of examples of potential change across the markets in that area yet?
Yeah, we constructed it in a very particular way that our recommendation was public. So the information we receive is anonymous. The recommendation that we send back to the board is public. If the board chooses not to take the recommendation, it has to justify why.
Okay.
And therefore, it's a standard board committee, so the board still has absolute authority to decide. and all the board has to do is justify why it's decided something differently, and that can be from a huge number of reasons. And this is why we created this separation, particularly for the ethics piece, that it was non-commercial, so it didn't have to consider the other paradoxes and dilemmas that a board may have to consider in terms of resource allocation or capital markets or anything else. We could purely deal with the ethical scenarios.
Cool, brilliant. So I read your latest article in terms of that you published a couple of weeks ago, Purpose of Data, where you were looking at trying to clarify and correlating it to things like money and various other things, but the purpose of data. Do you want to kind of talk a bit about what drove you to write that? And then I've got a number of specific questions just kind of pull out as we go of points that I was particularly interested in.
Yeah. So about 18 months ago, I wrote out of frustration an article called Data is Data. And, if you type in Medium, Tony Fish, Data is Data, it'll come up pretty quickly. Because people carry on going, look, data is oil, it's the sun, it's labor, it's gas, it's sunshine, it's just a whole bunch of stuff. And it's not. Data is actually it's like discovering a brand new element. It has its own unique characteristics. And an awful lot of way data had been articulated today is almost a diametric opposition to money. So money is fungible and rivalrous. And what I mean by fungible is it substitutes perfectly. Excuse me. So it's fungible, it's substituted perfectly, and it's rivalrous. So it has exclusive use. So you can only use it at that moment in time. So sovereign currency solves a particular problem of fungibility and rivalry. However, there's loads of other currencies which are can have non-fungibility and still be rivalrous, or they can be non-rivalrous and fungible. So sovereign money, has these unique characteristics of fungible and rivalrous. And what people were doing was saying, well, data is non-fungible and non-rivalrous, i.e. data is not interchangeable, but data can be used the data can be used continually at the same time. But the trouble is, if you compare non-fungible, non-rivalrous as a currency, it's like, trading in beans or stones or sand. It's useless. So what I did is, when you put data on that axis, you kind of like realize that having data as non-rivalrous and non-fungible actually isn't the best value of data. So what would be the axes where data would be in the top right-hand corner, and it's kind of like it's most useful? And my suggestion in the article is that when we have attestation of data, it's provable, it has provenance and lineage, and you have clear and defined rights and you understand what those rights are, data, it's most useful. So data can definitely have no rights and have no provability. And that's the majority of data we have today. But what we shouldn't be using is that data to take critical decisions. So if we want critical decision making, we should have data that has attestation and data rights.
And how close are we to, or how close are any organisation to getting to that point? Because I guess kind of the last few years have kind of clearly shone a light on, well, whatever term you want to use, fake news or otherwise, but information that is shared that may be based on data or facts that are questionable. So at what level does an organisation need to put those clearly defined rights, that proof of ownership, that proof of correctness, etc., in place?
So if we look at a company's data lake, so all the data a company has, so this is all of its internal processes, finance, HR, all its customer data, all the customer interactions, the supply chain ecosystem, a whole bunch of the data lake. We know that around, and this is a Google figure, about 3% of the overall data lake of most enterprise and corporates is finance data. So 3% of your data lake is finance data. And we know that somewhere between 80 and 90% of all decisions are taken on finance data. And the interesting thing is, the finance data has clearly defined rights because it's yours, and it's absolutely provable through the system. Now, audit raises an interesting problem, but that is kind of like data at its most useful. Yet, the majority of the data, like 97%, is in the other categories. So it may or may not have attestation, it may or may not have rights. And yet we're using it for data, or we're using it for decisions, and quite often we don't know that the decisions we're making is the right decision because we haven't got those properties around the data. And that fundamentally to me is the issue, is that it's not that it's not useful, it's where we assume that we know that it is, or it has properties that it doesn't have, and we're using it to make a decision which actually we shouldn't be using it for.
And building on that, every organisation is in a different position in terms of maturity and what it does or doesn't do with that data. But if you were to give top three things for any organisation, any board to think about at this point in time, in the context of the conversation that we've just had, what might you pick? Three key things to think about.
I'd actually not pick three. And I'd ask that, and it's a question I often sit down with boards and ask, and it's kind of like central to your thing about corporate digital responsibility. And I'd ask the question, what are you optimizing for? And it's usually because we have a pile of conflicting items around the board agenda we're trying to optimize for. So we're trying to automate more, basically to make ourselves more efficient, and data is critical in that, but we don't often know what data is being used to automate. We've got to humanize more because we know that the culture is important that we have, the relationships we have with customers is more important, and therefore we have to humanize more, and they're kind of like in conflict with each other. So which one are you actually trying to optimize for? But on that same map, we've got the other two, which is we're trying to decentralize more, which produces more innovation and gets rid of some cost. But we also need to centralize more, because actually some of the aspects that we need to bring in-house to make sure we have consistency have to centralize. And it's the same question, what are we optimizing for? Because we don't ask what we're optimizing for against those conflicts. We don't actually know what we're asking of the data. And because we don't know what we're asking of the data, we carry on creating almost a thesis, and then looking for the answer rather than actually going through a method to say, what are we trying to do and why are we trying to do it? Which is why I think what you're doing, Rob, with corporate digital responsibility is, it's super important. And I love what you're doing.
And it's a brilliant link back to, one of the other aspects of CDR is the environmental responsibility. I think you make a point at the end of the article looking at ESG data very specifically. I think for me, one of the things that I'm passionate about is enabling organisations to make a positive difference to address some of the issues that are emergent around environmental responsibility, climate change, biodiversity, etc. I'm interested to kind of just get maybe as a final thought, what your thoughts are on ESG data, and again, maybe what do we need to do differently in that space?
Yeah, I'm going to answer it by going slightly wider, which is, Sir Donald Brydon produced a report 2019 on the failure of audit. His report came because of Political Standards, which was Catherine Romano's book. He's the professor at Oxford University of Audit. Basically, his tenure and work since his PhD is why audit is failing. And not only failing, it's creating a problem that 10 years ago, you could take a set of public accounts for an industry, say banking, and you could compare the banks in that industry and actually come out with a useful analysis. Because of the change in audit, the way we do it and what's happened is right now, you can't even take the same bank year on year and do a comparison. And therefore, there's been a failure in what we audit and how we publish accounts. ESG has gone straight into the same problem, that there's this base assumption that all this data, which is inside the organization, is being fairly analyzed, even though we have no attestation and provenance and lineage of the data. And then it's put into 200 or 300 page report, which is then published, and these public accounts are then compared. And we've kind of got the same issue that there's no audit, and what is audit and standards are kind of like randomly compared and contrasted. So we're making investment decisions on behalf of the capital markets into ESG philosophies, but based on data realistically, which has no attestation and no rights, because it's public data. So I just think we're on a very dangerous ground, and we need to find a better solution. And I keep talking about having effectively APIs so we can actually get to sources of data, and therefore we can make much better, stronger analysis without the interpretation of a company trying to put its own particular spin on, which quite often is going to be misleading, because they do want to position themselves better than they actually are, and that's just part of human nature.
And I think, I mean, we started the conversation probably before recording talking about some of the impacts of the pandemic, the way we think, the way we are, the way that we work. I think one of the things that I've noticed over the last few months is that there is now a stronger focus around how do we do things better? How do we create more positive outcomes, both in terms of the planet and society and the communities that exist upon it, such that we don't have to go through kind of the traumas that we're all going through at the moment. And perhaps therefore we are at this inflection point where not only us as people, but businesses are very much thinking, how do we create and play a part in this active change? And I guess therefore key point from this conversation is, how do we get access to the right kind of data sources? How do we make sure that it's being used in an appropriate way? How do we get access to the right sets of people that are making appropriate and ethical kind of use choices? Final thoughts in terms of, from your point of view, what gives you faith that we can do things differently going forward in this space?
Bill Gates has been out publicizing his new book. He's put a lot of video work out there, and one of the things he challenges at the end is that to every individual that, yes, Bill Gates can do certain big programs, he can do great big things, but actually it's down to individuals also making a choice. And I think this is one of the things with data where individuals have taken virtually no responsibility, partly because they didn't know how to, and they didn't understand what the implications were. And I think we can't rely on the companies to go and do this. Yet everybody who sits in every company is also a consumer. So we have always these dichotomies as you sit around the table going, how do I want to be treated? Yet is that how I'm treating the others? And therefore the very people who are making the choices are quite often leading conflicting or wanting conflicting experiences, that they want some level of privacy, but they don't want customers to have some level of privacy. And I don't think we've got to the bottom of how we resolve that piece. And kind of, I bring it back to why you're doing what you're doing, Rob, with corporate digital responsibility, because that responsibility has to start with the individuals. And those responsibilities start with the individuals who then go into the corporate. And we're not having that conversation, partly because it is quite hard and difficult.
Indeed. But hopefully through sharing information, raising awareness of kind of some of the positive things that are happening, we can help kind of nudge it in that right direction. Tony, it's been a pleasure. Many thanks.
Thank you.